We have so little faith in the ebb and flow of life, of love, of relationships. We leap at the flow of the tide and resist in terror its ebb. We are afraid it will never return. How can one learn to live through the ebb tides of one's existence? How can one learn to take the trough of the wave?
Gift from the Sea has touched people all over the world. No matter what generation reads it, it says something very important. It's about marriage, it's about women's lives, and I think it's about freedom, about personal freedom.
The news is finally broken that after 3 dates together, Charles and Anne want to get married. And Anne steels herself and discusses this with her parents. And she tells her mother. And her mother just reflects and thinks. And she says, "Oh, Anne, you'll have the sky. You'll have the sky."
Anne Morrow married Charles Lindbergh in 1929. At the time, he was the most famous man in the world, the aviator who flew solo from New York to Paris in 1927. She was a recent graduate of Smith College, an ambassador's daughter who wanted, somehow, to be a writer. Their unlikely partnership is explored in the exhibition Charles and Anne Morrow Lindbergh, Couple of an Age.
Here we have Anne writing, "He opened the door to real life, and although it frightened me, it also beckoned me. I had to go."
She writes to her sister when he first takes her up in an airplane, and she says something like, "I won't be happy until it happens again."
He said we were going down the coast and over the city. It is superb. You must do it. The shadows of the buildings look so strange and futuristic. And strangely enough, he talked about aviation in a way I never dreamed he could, as though it were an end for greater things.
You look at them in all these fantastic black and white photographs, and you're reading about them as a couple flying across Alaska and on their way to Asia, and they're living in a world without GPS, without iPhones, without access to anything, being the first people to fly over this land. And despite the fact that they were living almost a century ago, they're still so modern.
My feeling is that her great rebellion was to marry my father and fly off into the air. I think that was her great adventure. And as great adventures often do, it had its high points and its low points.
They were constantly fleeing the press. The paparazzi is now just part of modern life. This really did not begin to the extent that we know it today until the night Charles Lindbergh landed in Paris. And now, oh my God, the most handsome bachelor in the world has found the perfect bride. Well, this just made the story twice as good. So that when they went off on their honeymoon, which they did in great secrecy, great planning, but sure enough, after a few days, the press found out they were on a small boat. And sure enough, the press boats start circling their boat just to rock it, so they would have to come up on deck. I mean, there was no privacy in the lives of the Lindberghs.
I have gotten utterly bitter about it. I have no patience, no understanding, no sympathy with the people who stare and follow and giggle at us, who ask questions, crowd, want to know about our private life.
It's been said that no one could have been more ill-suited for fame than Charles Lindbergh, and that might be true, but it's probably more true about Anne. Intensely private and intensely introspective, and kind of thrived on her interior life.
Anne had always kept a diary until she married Charles. She stopped because it might fall into the wrong hands, but she continued to write letters, many, many letters to her friends and family. She wrote about their flights through North and Central America, about house hunting, and about their baby, Charles A. Lindbergh Jr., born on Anne's 24th birthday, June 22nd, 1930. And she wrote about what moved her.
The other night I went to a concert alone because someone was playing César Franck's Prelude, Chorale, and Fugue. I am fascinated by it just now and won't be in 6 months, I suppose. You don't like it the first time you hear it. And then certain themes step out and you feel slowly the strength of them and the repetition of them and the pattern, and what a thrill when one day you realize that both themes are being played together at the end.
They had a young child. They were building a big new house in Hopewell, New Jersey. But no matter, Charles had a cause, aviation, and he enlisted Anne, who went willingly. She became a licensed pilot and radio operator. In 1931, the couple left Long Island on a flight that took them through Alaska and over the Bering Strait to Russia and Japan. Their goal was to map out new commercial air routes.
She was crew. She was critical. He could not have done that by himself. He certainly couldn't have done it in the spirit of St. Louis. And the aircraft that they used was a Lockheed Sirius seaplane with 2 cockpits, which is to be found with the Spirit of St. Louis at the National Air and Space Museum.
Mother, it has been the strangest trip, terribly exciting and new. I feel as though I'd been gone for months. The other night flying, I dreamt about the baby, and it was like another life. I couldn't believe I had one. I love to think of him with you. Along the coast of Siberia, we flew over jagged mountains, volcanic with glaciers on their sides. I didn't see much of the country because I was talking to St. Paul Island all the way, every half hour, and part of the time to a Russian station, and part of the time to SS President Cleveland. Charles shouted, "Here we are!" and I just had time to pull in the antenna and look out. This is a fretful letter. I'm afraid I'm rather wanting to be back with the baby now, but I can't fuss too much before Charles. It is such poor sportsmanship when this is a marvelous experience.
Their voyage came to a sudden end in China when word arrived that Anne's father had died. They traveled home immediately. Then, on March 1st, 1932, their year-and-a-half-old son was kidnapped, taken from his crib through an open window. For 10 weeks, the entire nation fixated on the search for the Lindbergh baby. Anne began to confide in her diary again, for the first time since getting married. Charles went into action.
He took control of that crime. He now had the New Jersey State Police move onto his property. His garage in New Jersey was turned into headquarters for the entire state. He was running the operation, basically. And every second he was awake was devoted to getting that baby back. Anne, she doesn't know where to begin. She's lost her first child. We don't know if it's dead or alive. Anne used to cry herself to sleep every night. She cried all day. But here's the telling thing. Lindbergh said to her, "You can't cry in front of me. And I don't care if you're sobbing yourself to sleep every night. You muffle it with a pillow. Because Charles, I've got to get on. I've got to do work to rescue our live baby tomorrow. We're going to get to Paris. We're going to get that baby back," because that's what Charles Lindbergh does. At the same time, she, being Anne Morrow Lindbergh, knew he was going through something. She recognized that. Recognized that here for the first time, Charles Lindbergh was not really in control. He could go through the motions of being in control. But when Lindbergh flew to Paris, he knew if he did all the preparations, he'd get there. With the kidnapping, no matter how much preparation you did, there's nothing he could do. The baby was killed from the very beginning.
The baby's body found and identified by skull, hair, and teeth in the woods on Hopewell Mount Rose Road, killed by a blow on head. Everything is telescoped now into one moment, one of those eternal moments, the moment when I realized the baby had been taken and I saw the baby dead, killed violently in the first flash of horror. Everything since then has been unreal. It has all vanished like smoke. Only that eternal moment remains. It was then and is now.
Writing for her was a way of understanding what happened. And what she did was probe, why is it that I feel so miserable that my child is gone? You can't even bear to ask that, but she did. She would just dive in and sort of embrace the horror and the pain, and you see real conflict, real agony sometimes.
Less than 6 months after the murder of Charles Jr., a second boy, John, was born. Somehow, life moved on. In September of that year, Anne and Charles flew to join her family at the Morrow summer home on the island of North Haven in Maine. Anne took the controls for the last emotional lap of the trip.
It is still there. It is all there. These islands sweeping out to sea, these islands floating on the top of the world, spilling over the edge of the world. They are all here, beautiful and still, spread flat before me, as they were the year before, and many years before, as they would be always. Daddy had died since last year, and the baby, I'm glad he lived in this beauty for a while. And I was happy, as though I had recovered them for a moment, as though I had recovered everything ever lost, as though I had everything worth having. If I could only have this height always. But we were coming down now. The pine trees were near and familiar, every day and human. I was coming down into the world again, the human world. The wind was cold on my face, and I had been crying.
Anne Morrow Lindbergh's writing, beyond its clarity and its beautiful language, speaks to women, speaks to men and women, generations later. Her gift was that she could really capture the universality of her personal experience.
Anne had always written, but she wanted to be a writer. Anne decided to write a book based on her experiences of their 1931 trip. First, though, another long survey flight with Charles, this time through Europe, North Africa, and South America. Although Anne was thrilled to visit her now-married older sister Elizabeth in Wales, the rest of the trip dragged on.
I can hardly bear to think of John running about. He is mine, and I am missing it, and no hope of immediate return. Ireland, Scotland, Paris, Spain, Portugal, Azores, Madeira, South Africa, South America. Will I ever get home? Ever, ever, ever?
After 5.5 months, they did get home. Her first published article was in National Geographic with photographs she and Charles had taken on their journey. It was a success. Anne began work on her book again, chapter by chapter, through the death of her sister Elizabeth of a weakened heart. Elizabeth was just 30. And through what became known as the trial of the century. For over a month, mobs of reporters and curious onlookers descended upon Flemington, New Jersey, where Bruno Richard Hauptmann was being tried for the kidnapping and murder of the Lindbergh baby. Charles was in court every day, but Anne only when she was called as a witness, and on the day her mother was called to the stand.
It was a far worse day emotionally than when I testified. I was freer to feel. That long, long morning of wood testimony, tiny, minute points, technical haggling. I thought with a pang in the middle of it, how incredible that my baby had any connection with this.
Finally, a conviction was made and the trial was over. Later that year, North to the Orient was published. It made the bestseller list and the reviews were good. Every navigator in the future ought to have such a wife along, wrote one critic. But once again, the Lindberghs were on the move.
They had to leave this country because of the press and the way they were hounded. They had to leave because there were now threats being made against the second Lindbergh baby. And they had literally a midnight escape on a boat. They stole away. The press wasn't onto it until they had set sail.
The people in Europe they knew who he was, but they didn't follow him and her everywhere as they did in this country. So she felt that she did have a life that she had never had before.
The Lindberghs found a refuge in England at Longbarn, an estate dating back to the 14th century with gardens created by the writer Vita Sackville-West and her husband, the diplomat and writer Harold Nicholson. They had recently moved to nearby Sissinghurst Castle, and Longbarn was available to rent.
I must keep this place in my mind always, part of the web of me, even when we leave it, a mark of permanent peace and beauty. I think how small this place would be looked down at from the air, how small to hold so much happiness, such worlds of happiness.
Anne had another child, a boy named Land, and she wrote another book. Charles designed the cover. During this quiet period, Anne was working through questions of how to balance being a wife and mother with being an artist, trying to understand why she even wanted to write, although she knew she did.
I must write, not because I feel I have anything to give. Hurrah! Not because being an artist comes first. It doesn't. Not because it matters to anyone else what I say. That has no bearing on it at all. But simply because the thread will not be strong without that strand.
But their time at Longbarn proved to be a rare interlude. In 1938, they were moving again, this time to a private island off the coast of France. And by 1939, it was clear that Europe was preparing for war.
Lindbergh felt this great imperative to get home, and almost like Paul Revere, to warn the country that the Germans are coming. And he went to the President of the United States and said, I've seen the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, and we don't have one of those. And the next war is not going to be about navies, it's going to be about air forces, and we have got to start doing something. And now we have this great topic of politics starting to arise in the Lindbergh marriage.
Anne was totally conflicted about what was going on. I mean, she had been through so much when her son was kidnapped and killed. And she had found peace in Europe, in England and then in France. And to leave that, a life that she really loved, and to come back to the United States where the ugliness was just beginning in this debate over the war. She had a premonition, a correct premonition, that this was going to be really terrible for both her family and herself.
America will be shocked out of its senses and will, in a wave of emotion, after a terrible fight internally in which Charles will be in the forefront and be extremely unpopular, go in at last, not wanting emotionally to see England and France go down, which I will feel too. The conflict will be prolonged. We will never see peace again, even after war ceases.
Charles did become an isolationist and a leader in the America First movement. Anne stayed loyal to her husband and even wrote a small book attempting to present a moral argument for isolationism. The Wave of the Future was another bestseller, but it was also widely attacked as a defense of fascism. Anne insisted it was not, but she later came to see it as naive and uninformed, and deeply regretted having written it.
I find I am hurt, not by the reviews exactly, but by the growing rift I see between myself and those people I thought I belonged to. The artists, the writers, the intellectuals, the sensitive, the idealistic. I feel exiled from them. I have become exiled for good, accidentally, really. My marriage has stretched me out of my world, changed me so it is no longer possible to change back.
Her instincts were always right. I think she deep down knew that what he was saying and feeling was wrong. But she did try to persuade herself that because she loved him. And she felt that it was her duty to follow him in what he believed and said.
And I have been forced to the conclusion that we cannot win this war for England regardless of how much assistance we send.
After Pearl Harbor, Charles joined the war effort in the South Pacific. Anne lived in Detroit with their children. They had 4 now, another boy, Scott, and their first daughter, also named Anne. She wrote another book, took sculpture classes at Cranbrook Academy of Art, and began for the first time to make her own friends, artists and intellectuals. After the war, the Lindberghs moved their family one last time back east to Connecticut, where their youngest child, Reeve Morrow Lindbergh, was born.
And she was home. Once she had the 5 children, she was home. She was with us. I loved my father. He was one of the most interesting, infuriating, energetic people I've ever known. Probably the most energetic person I've ever known. But she was really the strength of the family.
Up until the war, Charles and Anne had been a flying team. Their long flights gave them space alone, away even from their children. With the war and more children, these adventures ended. but they continued to work together.
I don't think either one of them ever finished a book without the other one going through it line by line, meticulously. It was a complicated, almost intermittent partnership because he was away so much. And she became more and more independent in her own way. But they stayed together.
And they still travel together. In the 1940s, Anne and Charles explored with friends what were then the wilds of Florida, sailing to the Keys and Dry Tortugas. Anne loved it, and she began to go every year to Captiva, a barrier island on the Gulf Coast. It was a place for her to rest and restore, often by herself.
I have had one full day and 2 nights alone. There is a special quality to being alone that is precious beyond words to me. I lay under the stars alone. I made my breakfast alone. Alone I watched the gulls at the end of the pier dip and wheel and soar and dive for the broken bread I threw them. A morning's work.
In Anne's diary was the beginning of a book. She described Gift from the Sea as a meditation on my own individual balance of life, work, and human relationships. Published in 1955, the book topped the bestseller list for almost a year and has since sold millions. Yet its success was bittersweet. Her children were growing up and Charles was gone more than ever. Often Anne found her own words to be of little comfort.
It is my month to be alone. There is a terrible irony in it, with Gift from the Sea heading the bestsellers week after week, preaching solitude, solitude. Here I am, having just what I say I want, and it does not seem to be the answer. Then is the book all hooey as I sometimes feel? I don't think so, but the truth of it is not relevant to me at this moment in my life.
You look at Gift from the Sea, and it has a kind of rosy glow to it. But I think if you start to look a little deeper, you will see some undercurrents going on there. And every now and then you may see a sadness. It's not a Pollyanna sort of book, in fact. Although things seem to work out, I think a lot of it is Anne trying to make things work out, trying to allow herself to understand everything that was going on with her, and in turn, I think, with women of her generation.
It's of its time, but the subject matter, is eternal. I mean, it is. It's your identity, and it's how you reconcile being a mother, which of course means being there for children that you've given birth to and are raising, but there's still that piece of you that was before motherhood, and how do you reconcile those two things?
It's very different from a man's life. I have said somewhere that a woman's lives are broken up into 20-year periods, that women's lives change every 20 years. They're educated and they have children and they have the slump and then they go up again and so forth. I think these periods of change are very creative.
By marrying Charles Lindbergh, Anne Morrow had opened the door to an extraordinary life, full of change. Yet it was a life that took its toll, especially as Charles continued his relentless travels. In the late 1950s, Anne had an affair with a family friend. It didn't last long, but it happened. Later, Charles had other families in Europe, families that remained hidden for decades, long after his death in 1973, and even Anne's in 2001. But despite the forces pulling them apart, their marriage, their partnership held. And throughout it all, Anne wrote.
And I think at the end of the day, Anne Morrow Lindbergh's diaries are really her legacy. It's a remarkable series of documents of the 20th century. Up close and personal accounts of one of the great tragedies of the 20th century, one of the great adventure stories of the 20th century, and one of the most celebrated and misunderstood marriages of the 20th century.
She had an extraordinary ability to explore private thoughts, feelings very openly, and to share those with the public, and yet to maintain her own individuality and her own sense of kind of private dignity.
You must have had an enormous sense of accomplishment on those epic enormous flights, and you must have come home with a great sense of possibilities within yourself.
I think that's true, but I also think I got just as much feeling that I was a new person by publishing a book. Having a child or losing your mother, or this is how you grow, through these sorrows and joys. Then life is never the same again. Different things give you a sense of finding your place in the world. Isn't that what one wants? One wants to find where one's useful, or where one can give, or where one can contribute. One must make a contribution to your world.
This program has been made possible with support from the Pheasant Hill Foundation, Betty W. Johnson, Colleen Goggins, and the Rita Allen Foundation, with additional support from the New Jersey State Council on the Arts, the Scheide Fund, and the New Jersey Historical Commission.